evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Ayanda. I'll be introducing Dr. Jeanne Tarrant from Endangered Wildlife Trust. She has a long CV, so I'll allow her to do herself justice by introducing to you guys. But thank you for joining us, and those who have booked for the night walk. After this, we're going to meet at the Kingfisher Community Center, and we're going to do a walk there and all things frogs. And then Dr. Jeanne Tarrant is going to assist us with the IDs and the calls, and all of that is going to be very nice and cool. Thank you, guys, and thank you to the young ladies and gentlemen for attending. Really nice to see you. Thanks.
Thanks, Ayanda, and thanks all of you for being here tonight. So I'm going to try not to talk for too long so that we can get to the exciting stuff and go look for some frogs. So I just wanted to say, when Ayanda and Rowena invited me to come and speak here tonight, I thought it's good timing. So we've just come through our national awareness. It's a day, but it's really more like a couple of weeks. And we've got people all over the country holding events and doing things to celebrate our South African frog diversity. So we call it Leap Day for Frogs. It's held at the end of February every year, and that's been going for 10 years now. So happy Leap Day for Frogs, and thanks for joining tonight as part of that, really. So yeah, to introduce myself, I'm a herpetologist, and that's something I never thought that I would be. I never thought that I was going to study or have frogs as my career. Honestly, these little creepy crawly things, and that's what herpetology means, the study of creepy crawly things, freaked me out, as they do a lot of people around the world and also here in South Africa. But I kind of fell into it. I'd been overseas for a couple of years and came back to study an environmental science degree through Northwest University. And the supervisor is one of the leading frog researchers in South Africa. And he said, "Do you like frogs?" And I was like, not sure. But I ended up doing this amazing study up in the Drakensberg and Lesotho. And really, I fell in love with these creatures. They're incredibly fascinating. I still learn something new every day. And so for nearly 20 years, I've had this career in frogs. And so what does that entail? It's very varied. And I think that's one of the nicest things about my job, is that no 2 days are the same. And I do get to travel around our beautiful country and hopefully beyond to explore places where frogs occur. And I must say that herpetology includes the study of amphibians and reptiles. So it's two whole groups of animals. And I always say, if the ornithologists, the bird people, were lumped into the same study group as the mammalogists, there'd be huge fights. So luckily, the amphibian and the reptile people all get along. We've just come back from a big conference in Hoedspruit, and everyone gets along. So the things that eat the frogs, we don't really mind. So it's very varied. It involves being in the field. In my case, it involves a lot of time behind my laptop, raising funding, writing reports, managing budgets, and all of this kind of thing, which I suppose is par for the course. It's very varied, and it's very enjoyable. And the more people we can encourage to become herpetologists, the better. I like another version of what it is to be a herpetologist. And it is growing, where there are more and more women entering this field and sort of turning on its head this perception of creepy, crawly, gross, scary things. Like, we really don't want that. Most of the time, even snakes are not actually scary and not venomous. Most of our snakes are not harmful. So we really want to change those perceptions among young people and young girls especially. So there's a lot of people, a lot of women in South Africa working as herpetologists. And I was last year invited to be part of the Global Women in Herpetology project, where 50 women from around the world are writing their stories about how they became a herpetologist. And there's quite a few of us from Southern Africa that are contributing to that project. So I am a herpetologist, but I also probably more consider myself a conservation biologist, and that's a whole mishmash of things. So we have to be good at all sorts. So everything from knowing your study species and being an expert and being a researcher on that, but then, really everything from children's education right through to legislation and sort of balancing that. So it is busy, but as I say, it's very varied. So to just jump in now, a little bit of background about what amphibians are. They are a really diverse group of creatures, and they've been around for a long time. So they literally crawled out onto land something like 350 million years ago, their ancestor. And they repeat that sort of process in their lifestyles today. So amphibian means, amphi means both, bios, life. So for most amphibians, they use the water and the land during their life cycle. And this makes them very sensitive animals because they depend on those two different ecosystems for different phases of their life. And so typically a frog will lay its eggs in or near water, and the tadpoles have to develop in relatively good quality water. So they're sensitive to changes in water quality, and then they emerge as these voracious little predators. So while they're in the water, the tadpoles eat algae, so they help keep our water clean. And then they come out, and they, as young frogs and as adult frogs, they eat insects. And so they play a really important role in keeping our pest populations, things like mosquitoes and flies, under control. And then on the other end of the scale, lots of things eat frogs. So they're really important in our ecosystems. So just some background in terms of amphibians globally are the most threatened group of animals on the planet currently. So animals with a backbone, frogs or amphibians as a group are the most threatened. So 41% are considered as being in the highest threat category, so critically endangered, endangered or vulnerable. And that's really a huge proportion of almost 8,000 or over 8,000 different species of animal that are declining. 43% are actually experiencing population declines. So given that these represent our freshwater habitats, it is something to be worried about. And we've seen really a huge number of extinctions, in my opinion, in just a couple of decades. And so a lot of research was happening to try and understand why this was. And there's really a whole lot of factors at play. But we've been aware of this since the late 80s, and we really don't want to be the frog sitting in the pot of slowly boiling water, because we are all connected to what frogs need, which is fresh water and healthy habitats. So those threats that are causing those declines are many and varied, with habitat loss being the #1 threat globally to amphibians. So amphibians live in all kinds of habitats. They're not just in our wetlands or rivers. Actually, most frogs occur in forests in South America, and we know what's happening there. Many frogs are montane grassland specialists. Others actually live in deserts. So we're covering this whole huge range of habitats, which as humans we're altering. So that's the biggest problem. And then the next one, because of the sensitivity, is pollution, freshwater pollution. Climate change is something that we're starting to understand more and more about, and something that we also have to factor in to understanding threats. So because amphibians are so reliant on moisture, they are very seasonal typically. So most frogs are active during the rainy months. So here in KZN, that's obviously our summer rainfall. Frogs become active from around about springtime, August, September, through to round about now. They start going quiet again, and that's very much to do with the rainfall. And so climate change is a big factor, because they have to develop over those rainy months. And if there's changes in that, or for example, if a species is adapted to a certain mist belt and that moves, these animals can't fly away or run away as quickly as other animals. So it's another reason why so many of them are threatened. Another big threat is disease globally. So when those declines were being noticed in the early 90s, a lot of research went into why that was happening, not in places where habitat was disappearing, but in pristine rainforests in South America, for example. And what they found was this fungal disease that's causing really big declines and even extinctions in the tropics and along the equatorial region. So it is something that's been studied here. For my PhD, I looked at all of our threatened species and whether that was an additional threat. And it seems that fungus actually evolved in Africa, and our species have some natural immunity to it. So we're not seeing these horrible declines like elsewhere in the world, which is a relief. And so we have somewhat fewer threatened species compared to that sort of global statistic of 41%. We're looking at about 30%, and maybe that's because disease isn't something that's a huge factor, luckily, because we've got enough to deal with. And so that is why the Endangered Wildlife Trust, which is the organization that I work for, I approached them in 2012 just as I was finishing off my PhD research and realizing that there was really great research happening in the country, but not a lot of that was turning into conservation action for our frogs. So EWT said, that's great, go raise money and you can you can do it. So I think they might be a little surprised that 10 years later we're doing that, and we're doing it very successfully. And so we really one of my first aims was to bridge that gap. So all that research is happening, but then what happens? A thesis gets put on a shelf, and that's sort of the end of that. So we really want to try and use research to inform our conservation and also to understand whether those actions are working. And we have many students associated with our projects. And then really to elevate the importance of amphibians and their habitat. So, still to this day, a lot of people that I speak to have no idea that half of these animals globally are disappearing, or why that's important for the rest of us. And then we also directly action some of these interventions that are going to help our most threatened amphibians in the country, and I'm going to talk a bit more about that specifically. And then really important is, how do we start to change behavior? How do we get the penny to drop that we all play a role in this, and our day-to-day behaviors can make a difference. And even if you don't like frogs and you don't become a frog biologist forever, you can do things every day that do help our amphibian friends. So as I say, I started in 2012. It was just me sort of setting up the program and getting a feel and securing some funding for 3 years. But we now are 13 strong, and we have projects in KwaZulu-Natal, the Eastern Cape, and the Western Cape, with most of our staff employed here in KZN, with 7 of us here. And that just gives you a snapshot of where we work and on what. So quite a big focus now in the Western Cape, and I'm going to explain why that is just now. And you can see number 6 there. We've actually introduced a reptile, the endangered Albany adder. So we are also working on a reptile as well. But just to bring attention to number 8, which is the endangered Pickersgill reed frog. I'm going to be talking quite a bit about that tonight. That's your special species here in Simbithi. So just what's happening in terms of that sort of threat level in South Africa. We have something called the National Biodiversity Assessment, and it's done every 5 years to give us a snapshot of what's happening for all of our biodiversity or nature. So mammals, birds, insects. And we looked at that for frogs in 2018. And what's important to note of that graph there is that half of our threatened species are endemic, and that means they don't occur anywhere else across South African borders. And so it's really important that we do look after our South African threatened species. All right, so we have 134 species of frog in South Africa. It's actually pretty good. I mean, we kind of forget here in KZN where it's permanently moist, but most of our country is actually quite arid. So 134 species is a good number of frogs. But what this assessment showed is that 85% of them are underprotected. So when we think about protected areas, our Krugers or our provincial parks, they were designed for large herds of game and, you know, the big sort of charismatic stuff, and frogs were not really factored in when these were designed. And so that explains that 85%, because most of these endemic threatened frogs are occurring on mountain tops or places that don't fall into our protected area network. So a lot of our work is around trying to change that. And 30% of our species are threatened. I mentioned that. And we've got this very high endemism. So the graph on the right just shows per province, and you can see the Western Cape by far has the highest number of endemic species. So like the Cape floristic region, really high plant diversity, and that's reflected in the animals in the region. And so that's why we do work now quite a lot in the Western Cape, because the most of our threatened endemic species for the country are there. Just to focus in here for KZN, we do host the highest diversity. So we've got the largest number of species. So of those 134, half of them occur in KwaZulu-Natal. So that's really good and really exciting. And if you are a frog biologist, it is the most exciting place to be. And we can expect half of those 70 to be in this area of Simbithi. So you're in a good spot for frogs here. 18 of our KZN species only occur within the province of KZN. 4 are endangered. 1 is considered near threatened. And two new little rain frogs that were described recently, we don't know how threatened they are or not. So we still need to assess that, which is something we're starting to do this year. I've mentioned the Pickersgill reed frog, and this is the species I'm going to be talking about, and hopefully that we're going to hear and maybe even see some later. So this species is currently classified by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature as endangered, but it was critically endangered, which is even worse. A few years ago, it got the endangered status in 2016. So this is actually a good thing, where that threat status is reducing. And that's because we know of it at many more sites than when it was assessed as critically endangered. So when I started working on the species, it was known from 10 sites historically, and we looked at those. It was only described in 1981, so it's a relatively new to science species, and I think that's got to do with its fairly quiet call. Okay, that wasn't so quiet, but when you're in the field, trust me, they are quite a quiet species. It's a little cricket-like chirp. And I think the reason that people didn't discover it for so long is that when you're listening to a chorus of other frogs, they're really noisy, and you've got your painted reed frogs whistling very high-pitched. And I think these little guys are actually just drowned out in that. So they are a KZN endemic. They only occur on our coastline from St. Lucia in the north down to Sizela on the south coast, and they only occur a maximum of about 14 kilometers inland. So they're very coastal. They live in these coastal reed beds, very dense reed habitat. They like deep permanent wetlands, but not with open water. So they're very habitat specific, and a lot of that habitat has been lost to mining, agriculture, and all of these kind of things. But the good news is that from those initial 10 sites, the species now occurs at almost 40. And so that explains why it's been downlisted to endangered. And this is just sort of a snapshot of where things stand currently. So 36 sites, and they sort of can be grouped into these sort of called genetic clusters. So the animals or the individuals in those areas are slightly more genetically similar, but really what has been nice to see through a genetic study is that the gene flow is good. So the disturbance to the habitat has actually happened quite recently, and there hasn't been long enough for that fragmentation to have any impact genetically. So we, as the Endangered Wildlife Trust Threatened Amphibian Program, this is one of our focal species. We use threatened species as our flagship species, but they really represent, it's not just about the species, they represent these amazing habitats that they live in, and many other species that they share those habitats with. So by focusing on Pickersgill reed frog in this case, we're actually able to protect many other species. So we're currently working to protect some of those sites officially. We work at 12 of the nearly 40 sites. We monitor, including here at Simbithi, and I'm going to talk more about that. It's also been the first threatened species in South Africa that was the subject of a captive breeding program. So through Johannesburg Zoo, they actually figured out how to breed the species in captivity so that when we can secure habitat in the wild, we can introduce captive bred frogs and bolster that population and increase it even more, and hopefully decrease that threat status even more. So how do we know that conservation is working? And one of the best strategies to do this is by monitoring our species and our habitats. And fortunately, when it comes to frogs, they are really, really good models for monitoring. So something that frogs do, which is something they brought with them all those millions of years ago and have developed it over time, is to communicate. And so each type of frog has its own unique call. It's only the males that call, and we call it the advertisement call. And he is literally around the breeding site and calling to attract a female to the breeding site. And yes, this happens in the spring rainy times. And so male frogs have what we call a gula sac on their throat. They blow it up, and for tiny little animals, they can make an incredible noise. And some people don't like that, but what we're trying to encourage is that actually it's really cool to have wildlife in your back garden. So we have got everything from the guttural toads. People think that they're bullfrogs. We don't have bullfrogs here, and that's that really deep noise, through to these guys are painted reed frogs, very shrill whistle. And probably good I don't have it on this setting because your ears really would be blasted off, but we should hear some later tonight. So frogs are a good animal model to monitor, and so we can use that to our advantage to see where species are, what they are, and then whether those populations might change over time, and also the assemblage. So, you know, do we get different species moving into an area or moving out of an area? And just important to keep in mind that big number of 41%, and that's why we need to monitor so that we know whether that's going to improve or reduce. So here at Simbithi, the Pickersgill reed frog was first discovered in 2011 by a local resident, Mike O'Donoghue, who was very excited, and he actually found lots of cool frogs here, also the spotted shovel-nosed frog, and he got hold of James Harvey, who is the frog guy from Maritzburg, who came along and confirmed that this was Pickersgill. I came along a bit later, and then I actually gave a talk here in this room in 2012, and Dudley Wang, who was in the environmental, the eco committee then, sort of rallied a team and to sort of start bringing attention to this endangered species that you had here, or at that stage critically endangered. And Mark and Dudley were really instrumental in initiating that monitoring, and you know, to start learning more about the species here and getting people excited about it. So they literally would, on their Sunday evenings each week during the breeding season, go out and listen across the wetlands on the eco side, and they gave us a really great idea of where Pickersgill reed frog occurred on the eco side, just through that manual monitoring, so just listening. And this sort of paved the way for some research opportunities and to start getting a better idea of what was going on. And so since then, we have introduced long-term monitoring using some recording devices that I'm going to talk about, song meters, and we've currently got some eDNA sampling, so environmental DNA. We took some samples in November, and we're waiting for results on those to better understand, well, what other things are sharing the same habitat as Pickersgill reed frog here at Simbithi. And all of this research has contributed to 4 postgraduate studies so far. And and that includes this work using these recording devices. So we call this passive acoustic monitoring. It's passive because you don't need someone standing in the field all night. We can stick these recorders up, and I don't know, maybe some of you have seen the song meters here. They are powered using solar, so it's really helpful. And thanks very much to Derek Lillenveld and Margie for helping with that. And that allows us to put the song meters up for a season and to be able to get data for the whole breeding season. And I must also mention here Peter Coulon, who was the environmental manager when this project started. He was really instrumental in sort of also rallying that excitement and starting to change Simbithi's management using Pickersgill reed frog as a management target. So here he is with a couple of students, and we're setting up these song meters to do acoustic arrays, which basically can give us the density of frogs at a specific site. And this is slightly more recent, so 2016 to 2017. We then started putting these song meters all over the place to get a better idea. We then confirmed that the species is also here on the Gulf side, and one of those song meters, the permanent song meters with the solar panel, is just down here as well. And this recording of data generates thousands of hours. So while it might sound like a good idea because you don't have to sit in the field all night, what it does is now give you thousands of hours of sound data. And no one's got time to look at that except for students, luckily. So we did manage to get 3 UKZN honours students in 2020, hence the masks, who helped out with some of the analysis of all that data. And that produced 3 honours projects. There's more to do though, and we really want to get back to using those density arrays to, I think the next step for us is to get a good idea of what your population is here at Simbithi. And population, when it comes to frogs, is quite a tricky one to talk about or to understand. So we can, put up camera traps for leopards, and we can say there's 100 leopards in this place, and that sounds like a little. But frogs, there are a lot of frogs in any place where frogs are. So when we start talking about thousands of frogs, people think, oh, well, then there's no problem. But there are a lot of frogs, but it's still important to get an idea of how many at a site, so that if things change or if the wetland is impacted or the wetland is expanding, then we can see whether those numbers are increasing or decreasing. So another general strategy that we use in our conservation work is planning, conservation planning. So we need to know what it is we want to achieve, and this is important for getting government to take action. So the Pickersgill reed frog is the first and only threatened frog species in South Africa to be the subject of a biodiversity management plan. And again, Simbithi was quite instrumental in that. We had the planning workshop here in this room in 2013, and it lays out all these actions to address the threats to the species. And one of the most recent outcomes of that was this map, which shows not just where Pickersgill reed frog occurs where we know it, but wetland habitat within its range that could host it, or that could that could be important places for the species to move between. So when we think about conservation of frogs, it's like I mentioned before, it's not just protecting the wetlands. These animals move considerable distances between sites, and so we also need to think about that, connecting those linkages. So this is the biodiversity management plan, and just a quick snapshot to show that essentially we are making progress against those actions. So the plan is for 5 years. It was gazetted by the Minister of Environmental Affairs in 2017. So we're at the end of our first 5 years, and we now need to renew that plan this year. But it's been a really effective tool of getting different partners. So Ezemvelo are a key joint partner with us, but we also work with Sambi, the Joburg Zoo, and the Department of Environmental Affairs, or now Forestry, Fisheries and Environment. So it's been a good plan that hasn't just sat on a shelf. It's actually really rallied action from these different partners. So as I mentioned, habitat loss is the biggest problem for frogs. And so naturally, the best solution is to protect habitats and sometimes create habitats where frogs can live. And there's a really nice example actually from Switzerland recently, where they simply made a whole bunch of ponds and all these frogs moved in, including threatened species. And so it doesn't have to be rocket science. And I think that's also what's nice about frogs in a way. We're not dealing with, I mean, we are dealing with a huge crisis, but it's maybe relatively simple. It's not like something like the rhinos, where all these animals are already in protected areas, and yet we just still, despite lots and lots of money, can't solve that problem. But with frogs, I have to have some hope that we can. And so habitat protection is one of the best ways to do that. And South Africa, we have really good legislation to enable that. And we are a signatory to the Convention of Biological Diversity, which means that we have targets to set for the country nationally, but also globally. So we are now in the 30 by 30 sort of race, where globally we want to protect 30% of the Earth by 2030. So it's a tall order, but we're trying in our little bit with our little endangered frogs on mountaintops to contribute towards that. And so in South Africa, we have a mechanism called biodiversity stewardship, which is a formal process with landowners or communal landowners that have high biodiversity value. And so that could be species of concern like Pickersgill reed frog, diversity of habitats, important ecological services. And so there's a whole sort of scoring system or process that happens, and that spits out your protected area category. The highest level is nature reserve, followed by protected environment. And sort of as you go up and down that, you have longer time periods. So nature reserve is in perpetuity, or 99 years on paper, but essentially that landowner retains ownership, but signs up to keep that biodiversity as intact as it is currently, if not enhance it. So the landowner keeps their land, but agrees to implementing actions that help these habitats and species. So for Pickersgill reed frog in KZN, we're working towards 3 protected environments at the moment. One of those is sitting on the MEC's desk for quite a while, so we're hoping that he's going to sign soon. But by adding 3 protected areas for Pickersgill reed frog from the 2 that it's currently in now, 3, we're doubling the protected areas where the species is known. And also just to say, sort of on the Simbithi, and it's also in Zimbali, these are really well managed sites. And in my view, they would qualify as sort of being equivalent to some of these levels, and Ayanda and I have spoken a little bit about what the potential opportunities could be around sort of formalizing that recognition. Overall, with all the 9 species that we're looking at across the country, we're hoping to add 28,000 hectares to what we call protected area estate in the coming years, including for our little snake species in the Eastern Cape. And as I mentioned, most of these don't occur in protected areas at all currently. So it's very nice to have a protected area and a nature reserve, but on paper that doesn't really mean anything if we're not managing that habitat appropriately, as I say, to enhance that amazing biodiversity that's there. And so, as I mentioned, Peter Coulon really used Pickersgill reed frog as a management target for Simbithi and actively put in place management actions to keep those reed beds as reed beds. And I think what initially happened is the wetland habitat really expanded in Simbithi after the housing development started. So it was sugarcane. Fortunately, those wetlands weren't drained. So these wetlands came back, which is great. But then also what starts happening is some of the swamp forest tree species start to move in. And so Pickersgill reed frog needs these open reed beds. And so some of the management is actually to manage that sort of encroachment, if you like, of tree species. So, you know, it's sort of finding that balance. And then more broadly speaking, through the Endangered Wildlife Trust, with funding from government, we've employed over 140 actually local people since 2015 to clear alien plants from Pickersgill reed frog sites along the coast in Ilembe district and eThekwini. And in the process cleared over 600 hectares of alien plants. We've now really scaled that down to our project sites and have permanently employed people, and we actually find that that's far more effective than larger teams that don't have consistent employment. And then we assess habitat health using various different tools, ecological goods and services, and then the more formal wetland health assessment. So yeah, I mean, I think that golf estates that are eco-estates really can live up to that eco side of things. And I think Simbithi does do that. And, you know, I think in general, and not just for frogs, what we want to see is enhancing diversity of habitat and, you know, having refuges where this wildlife can hide out, and not just these completely manicured greens. You know, watching your pesticide use is especially important when it comes to amphibians and their sensitivities. So there's an increasing, I think, global awareness of how these kind of places can contribute to our biodiversity protection. And in recognition of this, Simbithi Eco-Estate is a Pickersgill reed frog custodian, and we renewed that agreement last year for the next 5 years. And so Ayanda is going to keep doing the good work along that front. And we're really hoping, as I mentioned, to improve the monitoring and just, you know, keep on track of any kind of environmental transgressions or, you know, management that might affect the wetlands, but also the buffers around those wetlands. Another really important part of our work in general through the Threatened Amphibian Program is to encourage appreciation of our frogs, really, that these are not scary, slimy creatures. So going back to how I started, and you guys all being here tonight is a great testament to that. But yeah, we're really starting to see a shift, I think, in this appreciation for our little creatures. One of our most popular videos is frogs and their calls on our YouTube video, and it's been our YouTube channel, and it's been seen over 1 million times. And people from all over the world, it's just South African species, but people find that really valuable and really interesting. So we've gone viral on the YouTube front for frogs. And yes, we've developed all these sort of educational resources, frogs in the classroom, lessons for junior school learners, amphibian learning program for high school and school leavers. We screen environmental documentaries in the communities where we work, and we really encourage citizen science. So going back to what Mark and Dudley were doing, that's an amazing citizen science contribution. So people like yourselves contributing to our knowledge. And I don't have anything on it specifically here, but one of the best ways, and I'm sure many of you are aware of it, is the iNaturalist app, where anything you observe can be uploaded. And for frogs, that can include sounds and pictures. And that really helps to inform us of where species are, so that we can do those red list assessments, so that next time Pickersgill reed frog comes out as vulnerable, which is even better than endangered, and maybe eventually to least concern. As I mentioned, we've done some regional posters. I think we've got 13 regional posters. I do have some of these with me tonight, so perhaps at the frog walk component, if anyone's interested, I can give you some posters. And then, yes, as I mentioned, we hold events, especially around the end of February, but really throughout the year as well, and engaging with thousands of school learners and people every year to celebrate our frogs and to help people learn more about them. And then things like tonight and doing little frog tours. I was saying to Margie just now, we had a very wet Saturday, but 150 people rocked up to come frogging in the rain. So there really does seem to be a genuine interest in this. And that was from last night at Mount Moreland, just down the road. If you haven't been there, it's another Pickersgill reed frog site. You can see in the background there these huge extensive reed beds. It's actually a very unique system, and probably the only one that's remaining in this area. And the barn swallows also come down and roost there. So it's quite a nice show all round. You can sit and have a glass of wine while the barn swallows come in. The noise is just incredible. So as the swallows drop down to roost, there's a lot of ruffling around, and then as they go quiet, then you start to hear the frogs. So it's a really quite a pleasant thing to do. And yeah, we try and sort of any avenues that we can to get frogs sort of into popular culture and sort of into people's faces, really. And so we've been working with an artist, Robin Ansell, who's based up in Hillcrest, and she does incredible wildlife artwork. She's done a lot of small mammals, and she's really good with her birds. And then last year, she added some frogs to the portfolio. So I also have some of those here if anyone's interested. But she's done a great job, and we call it the Frogject. But she's really excited, and we're excited that people are interested in having some froggy art on their wall or as gift cards. I think I'm going to leave it there, and if I can give you a take-home message, which is healthy frogs is healthy for the rest of us. So we want these habitats to be functional and intact and healthy, and giving us all what we need. And yeah, thanks to all our supporters and partners. We couldn't do this work alone or without donor funding. And thank you all for listening.